Today's story is about the island called Easter Island, known as Rapa Nui to the indigenous peoples. The most iconic feature of the island are the moai statues that are instantly recognisable to most people interested in the culture of the world. Just who were the people responsible for the construction of these amazing statues? Where did they come from? What did they do? Why did they create these statues and how did they move them? When Europeans first discovered Easter Island in the 18th century, they discovered a depleted population who were no longer creating moai statues. So what happened to the people of Rapa Nui that changed their fortune? This episode focuses on the history of the island and delves deeper into its mysteries. The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler.
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Bring a date, your squad, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Volume 4, The Medieval World. Episode 84, Easter Island. We can trace all the way back to the 4th century BCE ancient Greek polymath Aristotle for the theory that landmasses in the northern hemisphere should be counterbalanced by equivalent landmasses in the southern hemisphere. Back in those times, there was little knowledge of the southern hemisphere, so there was very little to be able to challenge this theory. The theory continued to be seriously considered and was supported by the highly respected 2nd century Alexandrian polymath Ptolemy. So this was the origin of a theory of a southern hemisphere continental landmass which came to be known as Terra Australis. The discovery of this Terra Australis remained fascinating for explorers right up until the Age of Discovery. One such explorer was Jacob Roggeveen. In the year 1721, the Dutch West India Company sponsored Roggeveen to find the mysterious Terra Australis. During this period, the Dutch were working incredibly hard to head the monopoly on global trade, and they believed that the discovery of Terra Australis would go a long way to facilitate Dutch global trade. Roggeveen headed west from Europe with a fleet of 3 ships. Roggeveen's journey took him to the Falkland Islands, just east of the southern tip of the South American continent, before he would continue on to go around the southern tip of South America, sailing through the Le Maire Strait and then around Cape Horn. He would then travel northwards alongside the Chilean coast, resupplying at the Juan Fernandez Islands before heading off into the vast Pacific Ocean in search of the great southern continent. Roggeveen obviously did not find Terra Australis, but on the 5th of April 1722, his fleet would discover an inhabited island in the middle of the ocean. It was tricky for the Dutch to land, so initially they would stay out in the ocean. The curiosity of the natives led them to approach the Dutch fleet in their canoes. The Dutch provided gifts, but the natives were also happy to try and help themselves to Dutch possessions, and when the Dutch were finally able to come ashore, a native tried to grab one of the Dutch muskets, and this led to a bit of a scuffle. This led to the natives grabbing rocks and attacking the Dutch seamen, who opened fire in response, killing up to a dozen of the natives. Understanding the negative consequences of the tensions, both the natives and the Dutch chose a more friendly interaction in the aftermath of these killings. Roggeveen was shown around the island and realised that this was not the southern continent that he had been searching for, and so the Dutch left. While on the island, Roggeveen and his crew were able to make a number of observations. They noticed that the population was living in a small number of huts and that they were exploring the waters in simple canoes. Although the island was quite fertile, there was a notable lack of large trees. Much more considerable, though, were the stone constructions standing on the island. Roggeveen doesn't describe these stones in great detail, only noticing that the natives would sometimes light fires in front of the stones, but the stones themselves are now iconic to Easter Island, which received that name because Roggeveen discovered the island on Easter Sunday. The natives would refer to themselves and their island as Rapa Nui, oblivious to the Easter Island name being used by outsiders. This episode is going to investigate the mysterious island that Roggeveen discovered and offer some background and potential explanations for the things that he discovered there.
Origins.
Without the use of modern science, the earliest settlement of Easter Island is provided to us by the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people. The most prominent of the legends of Rapa Nui origin is the story of Hotu Matua. Hotu Matua lived in an unknown continent called Hiva, and in a dream he was led to believe that Hiva would sink, so he needed to find a new land. Hotu Matua sent out 7 explorers to explore the ocean for new land, and after some time the explorers stumbled across Easter Island. They realised that the land was fertile and a suitable safe haven for Hotu Matua, so they set sail back to Hiva to give their king the good news. One man was left behind on the new island, which we know as Easter Island, and notably a statue which we associate with Easter Island to this day. The statues are called the Moai, and we will talk more about them later, but it's interesting to note that according to the Hotu Matua legend, the first Moai was transported to Easter Island rather than created on Easter Island. When the news of the island reached Hotu Matua, he took his family and around 100 people with him on a canoe to the island. On his arrival, Hotu Matua would put in place plans to divide the lands of the island up amongst his sons, who would become the high chiefs of the island. They would call the high chief Ariki, which is also interpreted to mean a king, and so the tradition of Rapa Nui high chiefs would be passed down the generations until European arrival. In scientific terms, it is believed that volcanic activity under the surface of the Pacific Ocean caused the island of Easter Island to emerge from beneath the waves, and a guess would be that this happened around 3 million years ago, roughly the same time as the first species of human evolved. Multiple volcanoes have contributed to the creation of the island, all of which are now extinct, leaving the island to exist by itself in the Pacific Ocean. The island is 63 square miles of triangular-shaped land existing in a subtropical climate. It is considerably nearer to South America than to any other continental landmass, so from a migrational perspective, by looking at the ocean from Southeast Asia eastwards, Easter Island was one of the most remote islands lying in the very distant Pacific Ocean. So if we consider that the first arrivals on Easter Island were part of the Polynesian expansion, which originated from Southeast Asia, then we should look for evidence of that to give a scientific response to the legend of Hotu Matua. We have often mentioned linguistics as a branch of science which can tell us a lot about the origins of peoples and their associated migration patterns. Glottochronology is the specific study of the divergence of languages, and as the language of Rapa Nui seems to be related to other Polynesian languages, experts study the languages of those closely related Polynesians to see if they can provide a possible date range for the divergence of the earliest ancestors of the modern Rapa Nui people. Radiocarbon dating of agricultural techniques such as deforestation in relation to the slash and burn agricultural approaches can also point to a date range. This is essentially when existing vegetation is burned to produce a layer of fertile soil. We explored the science behind radiocarbon dating back in Volume 1. Generally, a date of around the year 1200 is offered as the first major settlement of Easter Island. It has always been assumed, due to evidence, that many of the Pacific Islands, including Easter Island, were populated by Polynesians, but there still remains a mystery at the centre of this assumption, and that is about the specific crops found on Easter Island. Certainly, the yams that were claimed to have been transported by Hotu Matua were being cultivated on the island when Europeans arrived, as were taros and bananas. However, there were also sweet potatoes, and these are actually a South American crop. Taros and bananas would have come from Southeast Asia, as would be consistent with the Polynesian expansion theory, and even though a certain variety of yam originates in South America, the variety found on Easter Island was Southeast Asian in origin. In the modern world, Easter Island is a special territory of the South American country of Chile, but all evidence of origin points away from South America apart from the sweet potato. Linguists believe that there is a definite link back to the indigenous South American name for the crop in the Rapa Nui name for it, Kumara. So all of this points towards a definite pre-Columbian connection between Polynesians and South Americans. And it is also possible, based on this evidence, that Polynesians made contact with South Americans before Easter Island was discovered or populated. It is certainly not out of the question. The seafaring skills and constructions of the Polynesians were so advanced that they were able to discover many remote islands, including New Zealand and Hawaii, so finding South America was well within Polynesian capability. So this is thought to have been the likeliest way in which the sweet potato reached Easter Island. Polynesians found South America and took the sweet potato back to Polynesia with them.
The Moai.
No summary of Easter Island would be complete without a discussion about the moai, the remarkable stone statues which decorate the island. There is no definitive count of the moai, but there could be 1,000 or more. They appear to represent the human form, albeit in quite a distorted manner. The statues represent a body, but due to the elongation of the head with exaggerating noses and brows, you could be forgiven for just picturing the head alone when thinking of them in your mind's eye. There is no evidence of the construction of these moai anywhere outside of Easter Island, despite the legendary story of Hotu Matua bringing Easter Island's first moai from another land. This firmly suggests that the construction of the moai is something completely isolated to the culture and the land of Easter Island. It is then interesting to speculate why the moai were created, and due to their immense size, how they were created. The largest moai is said to weigh almost 90 tons and stands 10 metres high. Those 7 explorers who were sent by Hotu Matua to discover Easter Island are represented by 7 moai of their own. The site of these particular moai is called Ahu Akivi. Ahu Akivi is slightly inland from the coastally located moai, and all 7 are perched in a row on a ceremonial platform called an ahu. Ahu Akivi, like many other of the platforms, had to be cleaned up and rebuilt as time had been its enemy and it was beginning to fall apart. So most of the platforms, or ahu, that you see today have been restored to their original glory by relatively recent efforts. The platforms appear to face an area that was once inhabited, which suggests that they were designed to have had a protective, overseeing quality. Various volcanic rock materials became the source for the moai. There was an abundance of these different rock materials, and this is reflected in the moai, which demonstrate the different types of volcanic rock used as you travel from ahu to ahu, although well over 90% of them are specifically made from tuff, which is a form of compressed volcanic ash. The moai are supposed to represent the revered and sacred ancestors that are seen as the spiritual protectors of the Rapa Nui. Ancestor worship is very common among the original Polynesians, and this kind of religion itself probably evolved from Southeast Asian or Far East Asian cultures. The moai would be full of the supernatural force of mana, a divine power which tied everything together and offered guidance and protection to the people. The concept of mana could also potentially be traced back to the Southeast Asian roots of the Polynesians, and is also recognised by other Pacific Island societies from Samoa to Tahiti to the Maori of New Zealand and the Kanaka Maoli of Hawaii. The moai of Easter Island raised the same kind of debate that surrounds many other constructions of the ancient world, that seemingly required an unusual amount of manpower and effort to complete them as a project. We have explored some of these phenomena in previous episodes, such as with Stonehenge in the United Kingdum, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and the colossal heads of the Olmecs in Mexico, among other things. The unanswered questions relating to how ancient humans were able to complete such projects without the aid of modern technology is something that fuels the theories of pseudoscience and pseudo-archaeology that has been brought to public attention by individuals such as the British writer Graham Hancock, who featured the moai in his TV series Ancient Apocalypse. How were the isolated peoples of Easter Island able to transport these huge sculptures across the island? One of the theories about why there is a general misconception about the Moai being carved heads instead of what they actually are, which is carved bodies with heads, is the fact that most of the pictured Moai are those that are incomplete at a site called Ranu Raraku. Ranu Raraku is a distinct and extinct volcano on Easter Island which appears to have been turned into a Moai factory, as the abandoned Moai to be found at the site seem to testify. It is a bit of a mystery why there are so many Moai there that do seem to be almost complete, but have not found their way to a new home like many others. It's almost like custom for the Moai dried up, but this seems a little bit unrealistic considering their spiritual meaning to the Rapa Nui. This is unless the Moai factory at Ranu Raraku operated as a kind of business where a team of people quarried the stone, carved the stone and then transported the stone in return for food, livestock, canoes or other goods. Observations at this site have pointed towards a theory of how the Moai were constructed and transported. It appears that the Moai were carved out of volcanic rock while still part of the volcano before being separated and moved to lower ground via a carved path down the side of the volcano. To move them around the island, it is suspected that a series of wooden roads were constructed so that the Moai could be pulled along the road. If we envisage the amount of wood that would have had to have been used to create this roller road, then there must have been a considerable amount of destruction of the trees on Easter Island to be able to achieve this. If this was not the case, then it could be that the Moai were walked to their current locations by many men using ropes tied to higher parts of the statue. Either way, it is still one of those fascinating global ancient construction and transportation mysteries. The completed and transported Moai would often come to be mounted on a platform called an ahu, as mentioned before when we discussed Ahu Akivi. The volcano at Ranu Raraku is a short distance from the southeast corner of the island, where on the coastline there is a large ahu called Ahu Tongariki. On this platform stands 15 Moai statues, including one which is estimated to weigh 86 tons, the heaviest Moai known. We know that the Moai tend to face inland, suggesting a protective status, as we mentioned earlier in the episode. Ahu Tongariki faces the sunset at winter solstice, and the one Moai at Ahuhuri Ahurenga faces the sunrise at winter solstice. Such respect for astronomy is also commonly found with ancient construction such as Stonehenge in the United Kingdom, the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, and also the Intihuatana stone at Machu Picchu in Peru, which is a site that we will look at later on in this volume. This is not to say that the Moai were erected with respect to astronomy in general, as there is nothing else to suggest that they were, but it does show that there was a probable awareness of the importance of astronomy. Some of the ahu are known to stand at the site of a burial, and so it could be supposed that the burial may be of an important high chief who was regarded as worthy of having a Moai built for them, so that their spirit or mana could continue to guide future generations, therefore making them a worshipped ancestor. It's possible that the ancestor was a warrior, and that there was a tribal existence on the island where tribes could come into conflict with each other over things such as resources or land. However, there is little direct evidence of conflict. Some have suggested that tribes may have competed with each other over who could have had the most impressive Moai. and weapons have been excavated such as spears and obsidian hand tools, but these could have just as easily been used as standard cutting tools and not as weapons for combat. Certainly, tools would have been necessary for carving designs on the bodies of the moai. The designs on the bodies could very well represent tattoos, which were an important practice of the Polynesians. The tattoos of the Rapa Nui may have represented status and the particular ancestral links of the individual, and subsequently helped the individual to channel mana from their ancestors represented by the moai that oversaw them.
The Birdman cult.
Birds had quite a prominent role in the minds of the Rapa Nui, as there were no mammals of note on the island, as was quite typical for Polynesian islands. Therefore, birds were a very important part of the lives of the Rapa Nui. It is likely that the discovery of Easter Island was thanks to observing and following the migration paths of birds across the ocean. Once on the island, the birds and their eggs would have proved to have been an important food source in the absence of mammals. So birds were held in high regard, and as such they featured heavily in Rapa Nui symbolism. Birds would be carved into rocks and feature in body art, but not only birds, but also bird men, who would look like a human with a bird's head. When outsiders started becoming more acquainted with the culture of Easter Island in the late 18th and early 19th century, they would discover a practice related to the Birdman cult. In the southwest of the island, there was a place called Orongo on the edge of a cratered volcano called Rono Kau. Orongo looked inwards to the crater but outwards to the ocean, and just over a kilometre from the coast is a small islet called Motu Nui. The practice was a competition in which the contestants would nominate individuals to undertake the treacherous swim to Motu Nui. It was certainly a swimmable distance for the more physically able individuals on the island, but the currents of the ocean were highly dangerous, and what's more is that the waters were shark infested. Simply descending to the water from Orongo could be enough to kill a person, as they would have had to have navigated a cliff's edge, which was essentially the outer wall of the volcanic crater. For those skilled and lucky enough to make it to the island, their mission was to find the egg of a Manutara bird and return it to the main island. The Manutara is actually the sooty tern, also called the wide awake due to their relentless calling. Once the egg was returned to the athlete's sponsor, the sponsor could claim the title Tangata Manu, which roughly translates to Birdman. The Birdman would be entitled to special privileges until the following year's event.
Decline.
Originally, it was considered that infighting was the cause of the decline of the Rapa Nui people, but with more recent technology it seems that a number of reasons could be put forward to explain the downturn in the luck of the Rapa Nui. As more scientific study was put into researching the reasons for the decline of the Rapa Nui, it became apparent that the island was originally abundant in woodland, but on the arrival of Roggeveen in the 18th century, that the trees were no longer there. The slash and burn agricultural techniques involved the destruction of existing areas of forest to create fertile soil suitable for farming, but trees would have been used also for the construction of huts, and also experts believe that trees would have had to have been used to aid the construction and transportation of the moai statues. However, more recently it's been suggested that we might have been too hasty to look for one overriding reason for the decline of the Rapa Nui, when history suggests that it can often be the case that there are multiple reasons for the decline of civilisations. We know that Polynesians unwittingly introduced rats to the islands that they populated, and in our last episode we learned that the Maori of New Zealand had to construct stilted storage buildings for their food and supplies in order to keep it from the introduced rats. It has been hypothesised that rats would have caused problems by eating young plants, and thereby stunting vegetation growth, and although this may not be the main factor, it could certainly have been a contributing factor. Imagine living in this society where wood was becoming more and more scarce, and then hearing that rats were eating your crops. These factors might not have been as critical in the early days of human population of Easter Island, as the legend tells us that Hotu Matua arrived with around 100 people. Recent estimates of the population before European arrival has suggested that there could have been in excess of 15,000 individuals at its peak, with there likely being less than 3,000 on the arrival of Roggeveen. This is a dramatic decrease in numbers if this were the case. If the island was overpopulated, then there would be an increase in competition for resources, which could have resulted in warfare between tribes, which would not have been beneficial for population numbers. Experts have also speculated about a global phenomenon called the Little Ice Age, in which the average temperature and climate of the entire planet was altered by a number of geophysical factors, and in turn this may have made agriculture more of a challenge for the bulging population of Easter Island. However, we still do not have a definitive reason which can give us more cause to cite a number of factors being responsible. The Dutch had no further interest in Easter Island after the visit of Roggeveen in 1722, and so Easter Island was left alone until another explorer called Felipe González de Ahedo, this time from Spain, came to the island in 1770. Like Roggeveen before him, Gonzalo de Ahedo only stayed at Easter Island for a few days, but González de Ahedo claimed the island for Spain, and with the firepower of the Spanish ships, the Rapa Nui had little choice but to agree. What is unclear is whether these interactions with Europeans brought exotic diseases to the people of Easter Island, which further depleted their numbers. We certainly know it to have been an issue when Europeans visited other lands for the first time during this period of history. Slave traders from the Peruvian Republic of the South American continent arrived on Easter Island in 1862 and abducted around a half of the island's population. If the population had not had to endure enough hardship in their most recent couple of centuries, then this action would have a profound effect on Easter Island and the Rapa Nui people. Things could never return to how they were before. Jesuits, primarily from France, arrived on the island in the same decade and began to work to document the culture of Rapa Nui and convert the people of the Rapa Nui to Christianity. The Jesuits would also work to install some form of social service to the population, including the construction of churches, centres of learning and medical support for the people of the island. Arguably, the Jesuits had a positive influence on the population of Easter Island, although some of their traditional culture was diluted as a consequence. The threat of Peruvian slave traders was also diminished when the Republic of Chile, a South American neighbour of Peru, decided to annex the island as a strategical outpost in the Pacific Ocean for their nation. Protection of the island would ensure that no European power could occupy it and use it as a base for aggression against the newly formed South American nations. Despite the dilution of Rapa Nui culture firstly by Europeans and then by South Americans, it is the island's unique and fascinating history which now sustains it in the modern world. Designated as under protection by becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995, the island's traditions and culture now attracts tens of thousands of tourists every year to the island, not least of all to observe the fascinating moai, which themselves do not have a guaranteed future, as the fragile volcanic tuff from which they are mostly created will be weathered and erode over time. So, for that reason, if you're ever lucky enough to visit Easter Island, do restrain yourself from touching the moai. Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of the History of the World podcast on Easter Island. A great topic, really good to go and explore somewhere so remote and somewhere not necessarily the most immediate subject that you would pick if talking about history of the world. But of course, the story, for me, it's unignorable. So wonderful story about Easter Island there. If you enjoy the podcast and you'd like to support the podcast, then please visit our website, historyoftheworldpodcast.com. Click on the Patreon link and sign up to make a monthly contribution. You will become a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati and qualify for gifts and rewards. Welcoming into the History of the World podcast Illuminati this time, we have Sarah Awan Johnson and Paula Hoover. Couple of there you go, a couple of American president names there, Johnson and Hoover. Thank you very much and welcome into the History of the World podcast Illuminati. If you want to get in touch with the podcast, drop me a line at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. Also, you can follow the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Tumblr, Threads and Mastodon. Now, before I sign off this week, I just want to apologise for the lack of output. But there's going to be a bit of a different format to the broadcasts, so to speak. And where we used to do listener messages and reviews at the end of the main episode, we're now going to move that into the debrief episodes. So the Illuminati debrief is going to have a bit of a makeover. We're going to now be calling it a debrief episode, where we're going to discuss the episode, the last episode, which in this case will be this one. So the next broadcast, the next podcast that you will hear will be the debrief episode, and it will discuss this episode that you just listened to, and we'll go through all the listener messages and reviews, and we'll be maybe able to discuss them in a bit more detail than we would normally. So looking forward to that. And then of course you've got the History of the World podcast magazine episodes, and so they're still going to come. So we're going to hopefully get a rolling system of main episodes, debriefs and magazines, and hopefully that will give a bit more structure and a bit more output than we've been experiencing lately. So the next episode you'll be looking forward to is the debrief episode. That will be coming between Christmas and New Year. So of course this is the penultimate broadcast of 2024, and of course the last podcast episode before Christmas. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for your support this year, and I'd like to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and be good.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Please consider making a financial contribution by going to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website and clicking on the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. And don't forget to join our social media at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Tumblr. See you next time.